very glad to have Susi Moser with us and Eva Rehse from Wings, who will be facilitating this conversation. Susi, as you may have seen from the invitation, recently published a report, the link is in the chat, on the tasks of now for resilience and philanthropy in the climate that we're in, various climates that we're in. And really, this conversation was on the back of what's happening in the world and how we can, what we can do differently. So Susi is a researcher on climate adaptation and transformation. She's also the founder of the Adaptive Mind Project, which I think you'll find all very interesting. And Eva is the Network and Ecosystems Director at Wings, and also on the a trustee of the Environmental Funders Network. So I'm not going to take any more time. I'm going to hand over to you, Eva, to go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Tamsin, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. As someone who's worked on questions of resilience, of climate resilience over the last few years with an environmental grant maker, and now with Wings, really thinking about the question of the role of philanthropy in strengthening community resilience, it's really exciting to be able to be part of this conversation and to see this important piece of research. So I'm looking at who's here, and I see a lot of us are also experts in this. So I think this will be a great conversation. So Susi and I will be in a bit of conversation and then really open it up to hear from everybody here and jointly reflect. But Susi, before we sort of jump into the content of the work, I'd like to kick us off by asking you to start maybe with a more personal reflection on resilience that feels very, very topical. So what does resilience mean to you personally today, right now, at this moment in time?
Good question this morning. First of all, let me just thank you all for coming and for this great opportunity to share with you about this report. But and just to have a connection to your world that I don't otherwise have. So Tamsin, thank you so much. And Eva, I really appreciate having this conversation. So to your question, and making that personal, you know, it occurred to me this morning, my partner right now has COVID. And that means that pretty much everything I do falls on my shoulders while I keep doing the work. I'm supporting someone who's going through chemo at the same time, trying to do whatever I can to support my colleagues in federal government. You know, and somehow what occurred to me is resilience is somehow the ability to keep on giving. I never thought of it quite in those terms, like that a system is still able to give. And, you know, you might wonder then, well, you know, that's an outcome, if you will, or a framing of resilience through an outcome lens. And what does that mean? Well, it means I must have still some store, some redundance, some ability to, you know, some resources to give, right? That's sort of more of a system trait definition, if you will. And what do I do to keep going? Well, I do a lot of self-care in the middle of all of this. Otherwise, I couldn't, right? And so keep putting into the system in some ways that it can keep giving, that it can offer whatever the system is about. So I guess that's a very personal lens through which maybe to just set the stage for our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that resonates definitely. And for me, resilience is and has always been really radical and political. And I know there are different definitions of that. And I've certainly been in conversations, including some that Tamsin facilitated, which sort of challenged that notion. But I feel that probably even more now than before, that in some ways it's very important for my own resilience to separate noise from fact, to preserve my sanity, my understanding of this moment, my analysis of this moment, and not to have to read every single piece of analysis and opinion right now. And I don't have to hear what certain people have said at certain moments, right? So I think that's for me, that's very radical as a political scientist and very political. And I'm also thinking about collective resilience, right? How we move towards action together through the sort of very natural pessimism and hand-wringing and that also erodes our resilience in many ways, right? So how do we fall back on the power of community and collective action? And that feels very much of the moment for my work, and what we're doing with Wings. So I hope we get to dive into that a little bit and also hold that sort of personal dimension that I know we each bring to this conversation. But maybe we'll start with just some background to this research. How did it come about? What was your journey coming into this topic?
Yeah, great question. So for those of you who don't know me, I have been working on adaptation to climate change for the last 30 plus years, long before it ever became a thing, if you will, and on resilience building. And so because of that, at least here in the US, I have a little bit of a sort of, visibility and leadership position in the field. And my colleague Joyce Coffey from Climate Resilience Consulting and I were approached in 2016 to do a first ever assessment of the state of the US adaptation field as a field of practice, as a professional field. And that was motivated at the time and funded by the Kresge Foundation. They wanted to understand, where are we? What is most needed to move things forward? Just move forward a few years, and the Packard Foundation came to us in 2024, midway, and basically said, can you do an update? Just a very brief really reassessment of what we came up with. And that was where the Packard Foundation was spearheading it on behalf of a couple of other foundations, the Kresge Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and the Walton Foundation. And in many ways, their efforts are an attempt to bring in many others who have maybe not worked on climate resilience in the past, but who are somehow beginning to think maybe they should. And so the question really became, what is it that they should all be doing at that time? So we reassessed it. We used the same framework that we developed, and I can speak about that in a moment, and kind of sort of took, if you will, the pulse on the state of the field, interviewed a few people who we thought were really, really smart in thinking about the big picture. And just basically updated the state of the field. And maybe what I can say sort of about this framework that we had. In 2017, we developed what we call the 4P framework. And what we mean by that, it was based on the extant literature on field building. And the question or the issues that kept coming up, we grouped into 4Ps. The first one, what's the purpose? What is this? What is the field actually trying to accomplish? And do people, agree on what it is they're doing? In 2017, they didn't. In 2024, much more so. The second one was, who is in the field? Who is doing this work? And are all the right people, if you will, included? Again, there's some significant shifts, and we can talk about, who is there and who isn't. The third P is around practice. What is it these people are doing toward the purpose, toward fulfilling that purpose? Is there agreed upon, set of best practices? Are we communicating well with each other? Those kinds of questions, right? And then the last one, and in many ways, the one that is maybe now most in question, is what we call the pillars of support. And by that, we mean both policy and the funding to support the work in the field. And that had, under the Biden administration, shifted significantly over the first Trump years, if you will. And that, of course, is now profoundly endangered on both sides, right? On the funding side, as well as the policy directives and guidance. He's dismantling it as we speak. So anyway, maybe I'll stop there and you can keep asking for deeper questions into the report. But that's basically how we got into it and what we did.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll dive more deeply into that. Thank you for giving a bit of context to this. And I've worked in climate philanthropy over the last decade now, and it's really encouraging for me to see that maturing of the conversation. You just said in 2017 we didn't really understand it. Now we understand it better. I see that too. I think there is a sort of mainstream endorsement of many of those thoughts and recommendations, and also yeah, just connecting resilience building as a key outcome of climate funding, right? That seems still very new, but it's becoming more and more accepted language as far as I can see. And that feels huge to me, because it also sort of highlights this paradox of how we learn, right? We need to take time to understand, to analyze, to exchange, and then there's the urgency to act, especially when we're talking about climate change. So I'd love to ask you a couple of questions about that, because that's, I think, what we're all grappling with here. Certainly, I know I am, but maybe before that, it might be useful to go just that little bit deeper for those of us here on the call who haven't had the chance to maybe look at the report in more detail, just to get a bit more of a sense of the content. And you already mentioned the 4 Ps, so the sort of the foundational field components that require intention and require investment for successful climate resilience. I'd be interested to hear your assessment of where climate philanthropy is making progress and where more progress needs to be made.
Yeah, well, it's interesting in the context of what you just said about how mainstream it is. You know, that to me, the terrifying thing is how not mainstream it still is. If you look at just overarchingly the amount of funding that is going toward climate resilience in particular, it is vanishingly tiny, right? I mean, there is what philanthropy typically, you know, goes into art and health and education, those big topics, right? And then the environment is like a tiny portion of that, and the climate piece is a climate portion of that, and most of that goes to mitigation, and then the last bit is for resilience. And so, you know, I will just say that while there has been an enormous increase in the amount of funding, it is vastly not adequate to the task that is at hand. So, so I'll say that first. What in the US, at least, I have observed, you know, in the beginning, when there really wasn't much of any policy directive or support from the federal government, and really haphazard sort of what the states were doing, and maybe a few localities, philanthropy at that time was really helping to invest in the people, to build adaptive capacity, to build their skill, to build sort of the frameworks, the way of helping to build, you know, how do we think about this, right? And how do we do that? In the US, they've also really, really fostered the centrality and the lifting up of equity and justice in that. So to really think more deeply about, you know, are we just trying to put band-aids on disasters or trying to come back from that, versus really trying to get at the root causes and bringing people to the table who have always not been at the table, those kinds of things. There was a lot of investment early on in the development of, I want to be almost literal, the 10,000 tools. Like everyone and their uncle funded some kind of tool. And so we have, I don't know how many tools for green infrastructure and, you know, and so on and so forth, right? It's just an overwhelming amount. It was not coordinated. It was not thoughtful necessarily. It always looked like, oh, here's a new idea. Here's a new idea. And in some ways, you can say that's what has to happen early on in the field, right? Where we invest in the innovation, try different things, and eventually something will percolate to sort of the canon or the best practices. What we haven't seen, and that would help in that regard, is a lot of investment in actually monitoring and learning, monitoring, evaluation, and learning from those early examples. Like, what is actually worth doing? And so, to me, that is a real loss or a real missed opportunity, and that's really not any better compared from 17 to now. So I'll stop here and you can intervene with more questions, but those are the first few that I would say where philanthropy has really helped to make a difference.
It's interesting now because depending on where we sit, I mean, you see the data and you see the funding flows and you're having the conversations, and these gaps are obvious for you in what you're seeing. And I'm looking at it and thinking, wow, 10 years ago when I tried to have these conversations, there was very little response. So it's
Yes,
maybe
yes.
exactly what we just said. There's a sort of the need to learn with each other and spend this time in conversation. And then there's the urgency of the climate crisis that requires us to do these things almost in parallel. So there has been increase. It's not been big enough. There are gaps in funding that philanthropy needs to address. And I think that's really also where your recommendations are coming in. And at the same time, I feel like there's been a more intentional conversation, certainly in parts of the sector. And the fact that we're even seeing research like this commissioned is a sign of that.
Yeah.
And I see questions in the chat coming up that go very much to this moment that we're in now, right? And this context that we are where this is happening. You wrote this report in the US for US philanthropy, and of course, what we're seeing right now has very grave, very radical implications for climate work, climate change solutions. You mentioned already the previous administration and where we are now. So do you have any first step recommendations, what philanthropy should be doing now, how to build on these efforts, how to build resilience now?
Yeah. Yes, I do. Well, I guess maybe the first thing I want to say here is that, at least in my own experience with U.S. philanthropy here, is that it somehow feels like philanthropy has gone dark over the last few weeks. And I'd be so curious to hear from everyone here why that is. I mean, I can sort of imagine it, but I would love it to hear it from those of you who are actually on the inside of that. And what I mean by that is, instead of jumping in and trying to buffer the blow that is coming right now, trying to capture all these defunded efforts that are so essential to resilience, there isn't a lot of activity, actually, or a lot of decisions, a lot of clarity, a lot of speaking out. And I think some of that I can totally understand, right? It's like all of us, we're sort of in this fire hose of what's all coming out of the White House at any one moment. We're also, trying to just simply make sense of what does it mean, what is best strategy. And what I have heard is that there's also an attempt to protect, to some extent, against becoming a target of the Trump administration. So all that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm not in your shoes. I can't speak for, making those choices. And it feels to me like it is so absolutely important at this moment to be a voice for what is needed. Climate change doesn't care. The polar crisis doesn't actually care about who is anywhere in leading positions. We need the help. And as people, instead of having a friend and a supporter from the federal government, as we've had over the last 4 years, we're now having an enemy, if you will, someone who's actively undermining and taking away, literally taking things back, right? The money, taking that back, taking policy progress we've made, taking that back. So in any way to buffer that blow would be absolutely essential. And I'll give concrete examples. Hundreds and thousands of scientists or experts from the government, subject matter experts, are being let go right now. That's such a loss of the brain trust of the federal government.
That's
people
tens of thousands.
Yes. People who have worked for decades to build up that institutional knowledge and expertise, and to catch that, to find people, places to essentially, find jobs, not lose it. I'll give you a very concrete example of what philanthropy could do. Many people in many foundations that I'm familiar with do not have resilience expertise on their staff. Well, right now there's all these people out there looking for a job. Hire them. They're the best people that you can possibly get, right? So that's just an example. Filling the funding gap. Even before we had this outcome of the elections, the federal government had only so much money to put into building coastal resilience, building community technical assistance programs and whatnot through different agencies. Well, there are dozens and dozens of projects that have been vetted, that have been put together with a lot of effort by communities, by organizations, to be ready to essentially carry them out. Why reinvent the wheel? Catch those people, get the list of the projects, right? And fund those. That's about as quickly as you can get to a really good set of projects, just as examples, but also just supporting what worked well, right? We know a lot of things by now of what is good practice. In the report that we offered, the Packard Foundation, we put in a number of principles that if you were to if you will, almost rate the projects that you have coming in according to these principles, you would make a positive difference right now, right? So whether it's new projects or the ones that are already out there, assess them according to those principles. They're in line with the realities that we're in. They're in line with best practices as best as we understand it right now. And that would be really important. And, you know, we talked about, you just mentioned it, people just move forward on their own. I think one of the big challenges I want to put before philanthropy is to actually work in transformative ways yourselves. What I mean by that is to not do it all by yourself, one foundation at a time, but lock shoulders, right? The Packard Foundation was part of a funder coalition. They made a pledge in September 2024 when Biden came out with his national resilience framework. And basically the commitment was that they would orient or at least make the funds that they're already making available, make them also count toward resilience, trying to essentially, you know, build resilience through many different channels. So if we can do that, then let's not only on paper say we're all doing that, but let's work together, have funder summits to think about the strategies together. You know, we need people coming from all angles at this problem, and that would be a far more aligned effort. I mean, it would be so funny that, you know, philanthropy funded us to get together, to think together how to address the climate challenges. Why not also do that on the funder side, right? So just a few examples to where to start.
Yeah, thank you. Let me say a few things about that. I mean, just to say, I agree with you on that last point, certainly. From what I'm hearing and understanding, the going dark is strategic and very deliberate, and that's been advised, right? Philanthropy has been advised not to speak up exactly for the reasons that you say, to not get on the radar, to be able to do the work behind the scenes. So what I would argue is that the voice, the advocacy, the standing up, that has to come from the philanthropy networks, right? Those of us who are organizing the space, that's why we exist. Pushing out individual philanthropies, even those with the most power, I think it will ultimately actually weaken us even further as a sector. And also the reality is philanthropy is not able to fill this gap, not as it is currently. There's just, the numbers don't add up. And yes, there are voices calling for dipping into reserves, and I think that's worthy of exploration because there are trillions in reserves. If this is not the moment to spend them, when is that moment, right? And especially when we're looking at climate and climate resilience. There are voices calling for an increase from the 5% of assets of giving, and that's certainly sort of the rule of thumb in the US. Again, worth of a conversation, certainly. What difference can we make there? I've heard conversation around, oh, now we'll have Chinese aid come in as if US foreign aid was not political. You know, I think there's some really, really interesting conversations happening. This is the moment for us where, for me, we need to break out of our narrow understanding of philanthropy and really reimagine this whole architecture that we've all sort of been part of. And really thinking about what philanthropy is. It's not just one way of giving, right? It's about individual generosity. It's about the movements of giving, the unusual actors, the dependencies that exist and why they exist, right? How can we reimagine those and build on cultures of giving that can look very different depending on where we sit. And also, what is philanthropy's actual role then, if we are thinking about it not necessarily as this sector that has to shoulder all of this and resource all of this, but is a partner with communities, is a partner with public sector, with private sector. what role do we play? Is it, like you say, giving us funding, the spaces for us to have these conversations? Is it to take the risk? Is it to pilot ideas that others can scale? I think that's exactly the kind of conversation that we're hoping to have now in the sector. And we have a call tomorrow with our network, where we have lots of different voices from lots of different cultures of giving, sharing that. So I'd be really keen to make the connection to the conversation here, and also some of the reflections I'm seeing in the chat that I definitely want to get to. But one of the questions that really sits with me with all of that is, I guess, how we keep focused on long term when short term feels so urgent, right? So I guess from a resilience building perspective, how do you build resilience when the shocks just keep coming? And when some of the very language that we use is actually policed, is tried to get eradicated from the lexicon. I'm wondering if you, in your research, in your conversations, if there's anything there that can help us navigate through that moment.
Yeah, I really appreciate all these comments and thoughts. I guess maybe where I want to start with this is, I was asked just yesterday to give a presentation to young fellows in a program in AmeriCorps program here, which is federally funded, right? And it is basically a capacity building initiative for young folks to get into jobs. And as I was invited to give this talk to them, I was also handed a list of the words I can't use. So whatever we've just been talking about, I couldn't use any of those words: governance, adaptation, climate resilience, whatever, all those things. So I was like, how the hell do I talk about this now? How do I talk about this now? Well, what I ended up doing is actually using poetry, myth, and storytelling. And that was incredibly powerful. After an hour, I had 120 people who were actually really inspired to keep going while they were really depressed at the beginning and fearful, very legitimately so. So I think there are ways in which we can be super subversive in this space. And I want to really encourage you all and nudge you on to try different things and use artwork and all kinds of alternative ways of communicating that we haven't used before. So that's maybe one way to, it doesn't lend itself to a press release, I'll give you that. But there are really powerful ways to talk. To your question about short-term versus long-term, well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind when I think about that is that it sort of sets up a dichotomy, as if we would do something different in the short term versus the long term. And I'm not sure that's entirely true, or at least we can, whatever we invest in now in the short term to deal with the outfall of what's happening right now, and to deal with, every next disaster that's coming up, invest the money in a way that is consistent with the long-term regeneration of systems, the long-term investment in the resilience, right? So flexibility, do they have redundancy? Do they rebuild the stores? Do they build capacity, right? Those are the kinds of things, literally taken from resilience theory, to invest in systems in a way, in the short term, that doesn't undermine, at least helps way. Oh, no, there you are. That at least invests in a system in a way that doesn't undermine its long-term capacity to function. So that, I think, is, I just want to sort of say that as a strategy. And then, of course, there is, simply, is it a divide and conquer in terms of where some of the philanthropic organizations reinvest in media and communication and a democratic landscape, if you will, that allows people to have a very different set of information available, or is it more that you invest just in pilots and really lift them up? I'm not sure that's needed to decide, but it feels to me we have to have a deeper analysis of why did we get here. And as long as we, are just symptoms, I don't think we're getting
Not just me, is it?
No, I think that is Susie. It's probably the snow in Vermont.
Like she's dropped off. I'm sure she'll join again in a second. I have lots to say about what she just said. I just also want to appreciate the comments in the chat, and I'm collecting them, and we'll definitely get to them, the comments and questions. So appreciate everybody actively participating. Let's give Susie a minute to come back. There you are. Can you hear us? No.
Yeah. Well, Eva, do you want to pick up?
Yes, I can pick up where Susie left off, and then if she wants, when she's back, we'll make sure that she can pick it up again. So, I mean, I like the idea of using creativity and subversiveness. I see questions on language in the chat. I definitely think we want to come back to that. I also want to remind us that in some ways we've been here before, right? We've had these conversations around COVID. I remember it vividly. And we saw actually many practices change and in philanthropy, and then it didn't stick, right? It has to stick now. I will say this, and when Susie's back, I would love to get her reflections on this. Many of the recommendations we've seen before, and that makes sense, right? We know the path. It's not like the path is not known. So if I can be maybe a bit provocative here, I think we need to be more courageous. We need to be bolder. We need to actually begin to think in short-term timeframes, because what we're talking about here is the climate crisis, which is a very short-term time frame. So what I said earlier about why are foundations not dipping into reserves, what are we holding back from? What are we preserving by hanging on to our capital? What would it look like if we spent down now for climate philanthropy to invest in resilience, to spend into infrastructure, into the systems changers, rather than project by project by project, and do it in the way that the report also outlines all of the ways that 16 years ago I wrote this report for Civicus called The Intelligent Funder, basically the same recommendations. And that feels a bit discouraging, right? Fund flexibly, fund unrestricted, fund directly. So where have we seen progress, and where are we still stuck? And why is this not the moment where we get unstuck? So maybe that's my provocation. And so maybe while we wait, I don't think Susie has been able to rejoin us.
Not yet.
Then yeah, let's see who would like to respond to that and what you've heard from Susie. I know there's a very active chat going on. Would anyone be willing to share? Maybe I know there are many of you here who've been in philanthropy for a very long time and who have had these conversations many times over. How are you responding to these ideas of resilience and resilience building in this moment?
Heather, did you want to raise your points, which I thought were interesting?
Is that me?
As you?
Sure. Yeah, I was trying to think about how I could be succinct in trying to answer some of Eva's questions. I mean, I joined the foundation that I run 3 years ago, and they had some noble ideas, but didn't really know how to implement. I mean, even what I consider fairly basic, which is trust-based philanthropy. I think someone brought that up in the comment. And so it took me some time to help really I mean, this is a generational issue as well. I think I really need to name that. Having worked with enough boards of, especially, I work mostly in family philanthropy, and some of them have been very large. But there's a massive generational difference between the silent generation, boomer, X, to millennial and beyond. And so I've been trying to help, cut through a lot of the ideologies that come from each generation to really presence people. I think that's a big issue in philanthropy too. When you ask Eva, what about short term and spending down? I think that's a really compelling proposition. And for many philanthropists, I think they're actually thinking about it right now, because what does 30 years from now really mean? None of us actually know. And I think especially in the US, both with the domestic response to what's going on federally, and we work both with domestic nonprofits and international. And so right now I'm trying to establish, sort of rapid fire. It does remind me a lot of COVID, like rapid response plans, which is a part of resiliency planning. I mean, stabilize for now, assess landscape, understand where we're going. And we work I'm trying to answer like 13 questions in one sentence, so I don't occupy too much time. But, we work across a variety of areas. My expertise is actually in the environment and sustainability and climate, none of which I technically fund, although we do work in disaster relief and preparedness, which is a resiliency practice, which I really, again, spent the last couple of years helping my board to understand. So I wonder if this relates back a bit to the presenter's original comment on hiring experts who can come in and help you to, really weave together that investments in health, are investments in the environment and in climate. And the reverse is also true. Like there's a massive, I'm tired of this siloed approach that philanthropy has taken. I mean, this is fundamentally intersectional everywhere that we're investing in all of the work that we're doing. But as far as now goes, I do think a lot of us are responding. In fact, a lot of us are up really, really late and really, really, really early, trying to make guarantees to our funded partners that have been well vetted by us and are doing the work in the world, that we're here for them and are supporting them in the ways that we can today, all the while trying to understand what does a 30, 60, 90-day plan look like? Because we don't know. Every day is different. And then thinking more broadly, in the event that government funding domestically and internationally is actually diminished for the foreseeable future, given the resources that we have, what can we actually do? And I think Lucy brought up a point about the big guys, the over 500 million. I do think they have a big part to play here. But again, we all know we can't make up for the deficits that are coming, but we can strengthen systems, we can be innovative, and we can absolutely invest in a trust-based way, which we do, and focus more on strengthening and shoring up. I don't want to keep, I could just go on all day. I couldn't believe it. Tamsin, when you said it, I was like, how do I summarize this? I've been up since 6 a.m. with working on things happening in Sudan, because not only is their funding gone, that's just been genocide. So anyway, a lot of us are working really hard. A lot of us are talking to other funders about how we can leverage our resources and come together and amplify those resources. And a lot of us aren't speaking publicly because there's certainly danger, but I think there's also a desire to want to be able to articulate a really developed and well thought out strategy, which is a little bit hard to do when we're in like rapid response mode right now. So yeah, I guess as a funder and as somebody who represents a foundation, like I would say, like, to allay some fears that there are many of us who are actually doing this work in the best ways we can right now. And I mean, I'm very interested in hearing what everyone else has to say. So thanks for the invitation, Tamsin. I'll jump off now.
Thank you, Heather, for bringing in that perspective. And you also perfectly connected to something that I wanted to pick up and that really gave me hope from the report. And Susi, you're back with us.
Yes, I'm so sorry. My computer crashed. Not all new inventions are going to work like Windows 11.
Well, very happy that it was the computer and not your internet, and then you're back here. And I can ask you this question. So maybe as the last question before we take on some of the reflections that we've heard in the chat and also the points that Heather just raised. One is the point around thinking about it in intersectional ways and focusing on intersectional approaches and collaboration. And for me, and seeing this as a key recommendation of the report, for me, that's really where I have hope, where I see a lot of potential for us to collectively tackle not just the larger climate crisis, but also this moment that we're in right now that is making our work so much harder. So I'm wondering what you're hearing from philanthropy about collaboration, both in terms of the barriers that are there, but also where it's working really well and what we can highlight as opportunities to learn from and to replicate and to scale.
Yeah, again, a great question. And I want to say, I want to hear that from you, because, my daily interaction is not so much with philanthropy as it is with the people working on the stuff on the ground, right? What I have observed is that it seems to work actually quite well at the staff level, maybe even at the CEO level. I find it much more siloed and like, we know best and go away. We don't want to talk to you at the board level. I don't know if that's an adequate description and you would agree with that, but that's certainly my observation, that people just simply see the necessity and want to coordinate, want to learn from each other, want to sort of clarify, okay, here's our niche, here's your niche, how can we work together, how could even the whole attempt behind this report, right? It was 4 foundations coming to support it and wanting to learn about it, and they had a meeting, I think it was last December, in Boston, to bring in 20 additional funders. So, and that was, like I said, mostly the staff and CEO level. And I think that's really fruitful, right? That to me gives me hope that people are seeing the benefit of, given the size compared to, say, federal funding, that you're at least becoming much more strategic together as opposed to doing it all separately. So that to me is sort of the most promising and where I see it working. I don't know how widespread that is, but that's where you come in. That's where I hand it over to you to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, for me, collaboration is the future of philanthropy. I think that we understand the problems are so interconnected, so the solutions have to be as well. Yeah, in many ways, we're in a lot of these problems because we've been so siloed. And that's normal. And at the same time, I see that there is a real desire to break out of that, because it's well understood. And there are barriers and they're real, but there are also so many examples of how that's been overcome. And when I say collaboration, I mean, yes, collaboration between philanthropies, but also between community, civil society, and philanthropy, and then also wider sectors. And that's where I see a lot of opportunity for philanthropy to show up as a partner to public sector and private sector actors in ways that maybe we haven't necessarily always felt comfortable with. And again, there are real barriers on philosophy and approach, but they can be overcome. And certainly at Wings, we've commissioned research, and we're really keen to work with partners on understanding that point. And I see it in your research as well. How do you collaborate with the private sector to address these questions?
It's a critical actor, right? Especially now, given sort of the size of the investment that's needed. Where is that money? Well, it can be found, and obviously, the private sector has its own interests, not only in shoring up its own assets, its own operations and staff and whatnot, but in terms of actually being able to replicate or help spread, help fund, help invest in. It changes our understanding, sort of, if you will, of many of the adaptation measures. With climate change mitigation, we have sort of developed markets for carbon and those kinds of things, right? So in that instance, it's more obvious how the private sector can help. I think we haven't quite come to sort of commercializing, and really economizing adaptation in the same way. I don't know if we should in all cases, by any stretch of the imagination, as long as we keep having sort of the same paradigms, right, of profit making to bring to this. I think we're not deeply transforming. And the reality is that the private sector needs to be a player at the table, given its magnitude and importance in all of our lives. So we have to find some way of moving forward. And I'll be the first to sort of be for deep transformation and changing us at the paradigmatic level. And things are too urgent. We can't wait for that, right? So how can we move in that direction through maybe some really fruitful partnerships in the meantime? It's just simply a necessity. People need to survive. We see it now. This isn't just about a few staff being let go, right? Or some funding shortage. It is a profoundly endangering situation and taking away the entire apparatus of how to function at all. So
it's life and death, and I think we all feel that, and that is also the moment where paralysis can set in, right? And pessimism can set in. And that is the moment where resilience is needed. And as I said at the beginning, it's the really radical act, is the things that Heather talked about. We keep going, we work really long hours, we support our partners, and we see that across the sector. And then it is also about thinking, well, where are the ways in which we can do things differently? And many of the recommendations in the report, as I was saying, are known to us, and we've seen some action after COVID. So how do we pick that up again? What have we learned from that moment? And I see progress, and I see the interest in collaborating. I would also say that we should, much like with philanthropy, we should break out of a narrow understanding of what we mean with private sector. In many of the regions and countries where Wings has members and works, we're talking about small and medium-sized family enterprises who are really close to communities and really working within communities. It's not just the big sort of problematic actors. And so I think there again, thinking about an ecosystem of very different actors in very different spaces can probably help us to navigate this moment. To me, it feels like a good moment to open up a bit more to you all here, and maybe dive into a few of the questions that have come up in the chat. One that I see coming up quite a bit is around the language we use. So there's a very specific question around the difference between resilience and adaptation. It would be great if you could reflect on that a little bit. And then there is a more provocative question around whether resilience framing is actually tactically the smartest right now, or if there is other language that needs to be used to move through this moment and live up to the potential of what you're recommending in the report. So maybe we'll start with those two questions that are more focused on language.
Yeah, and apologies again for my computer challenges. So the difference between adaptation and resilience, it's not just semantics, although for many years we've tried to survive on resilience to guard against any attacks on climate change mention in the context of adaptation. So adaptation as measures to prepare and manage the impacts of climate change is a very specific set of activities. Resilience, as I said, sometimes used as a synonym when it is used in a sort of process way, but for many people it is a matter of outcome, like what do we achieve by adapting to, right? And the way the evolution of the definition of resilience has occurred over the last 50 or so years, coping with disaster, adapting to disaster, or adapting to changes and transforming have all become part of the sort of necessary activities to remain resilient. So as an outcome. And then there are people who think of resilience more as a system trait, right? What are the characteristics, the characteristics of the system, like flexibility or adaptive capacity or redundancy, that characterize a resilient system. So there are many, many more interpretations of resilience than of adaptation. Let's put it that way. In terms of what was your second question, whether it serves us well? I want to make sure I get the question right.
Yeah, whether it's the smartest framing to use right now.
For me, the framing is always a question of who you're talking with. I don't think there is a generalized answer. Right now, the word resilience is not yet on the shoot down list. So for now, we can use it, at least in the US context. It is a difficult concept for many people. Resilience has a very negative connotation. One of the most resilient things of all is poverty and racism. They're super resilient, really resistant to change. So there are many pros and cons of using resilience. And all I would say is it depends on who you speak to. Maybe it's not at all something you want to do if you want to stay behind the scenes and simply, help communities deal with whatever they're dealing with, whether it's, in the context of disaster or environmental change more broadly, or the polar crisis more generally. I think what we found with this report and all the people we talked to, I can actually just maybe remind people of what we came up with. Resilience as the ability to keep going in all ways, physically, psychologically, socially, economically, culturally, politically, even as things around us fall apart. That was the sense that emerged from our interviews with for this report. So that, I think, sounds quite right to me. We might not use those fancy words, but that's kind of what people want to do right now.
There's someone in the chat points out it's really also about the principles, the practices behind that concept, right? And that's really what we're also talking about here, resilience building. I don't want to put you on the spot, Stacey, but I just spotted your comment, and I would love to hear from you and hear a bit more in the context of language, but also going deeper into different perspectives on philanthropy coming from a Global South philanthropy. So Stacey, if you are with us, I'd love to invite you into this conversation.
Hi there, sure, yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone. So I'm based in Barbados. I'm the co-founder of an NGO called Climate Rights and Justice International, and we do focus on kind of highlighting the needs of Indigenous Caribbean communities. So we have collectively in the region experienced, the concept of philanthropy being more about maintaining a certain status quo or a certain image that we will always need help. And that's the resilience that built into it, that will never change. That it's not really about really empowering communities so that eventually they don't necessarily need that system. It's about keeping the cogs in the machine of giving and giving, but not really building the capacity or building the communities, because we use words like resilience, which are very abstract, but resilience are people. When we say invest in resilience or invest in systems, we're talking about people at the heart of all of these as well. So I think from our perspective, what we're looking to do is try to see again in the region, because of the post-colonial fragmentation of who we are and our connections to each other, how can we start to build connections that are more horizontal as opposed to kind of going, vertically up or down? And that, that top-down model, never mind, we're all going to be in this way. So we're going to look different areas of the Global South. So outside of the region, but still from a Global South perspective, where we want to build an identity based on that diversity, if that makes sense. And I think building and strengthening our identity through seeing what do we have in common, what are our shared struggles, which can transcend climate, can transcend region, but we have a shared history of being given handouts, but that the impetus behind that, the ethos behind that was not really to make us stronger. It was to maintain a status quo. And we don't even, I in my organization, we don't use the term small island developed states anymore. We say big ocean states. If you look at the globe, from where the Pacific Ocean is, it's huge. We are large ocean states. We're big ocean states. We're not small island developed states. So that's just a little bit. I like one of the colleagues here. I could go on and on as well, but I just want to, I wanted to join the conversation to get an idea of what was happening outside in the world. It's very easy to feel isolated here. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Stacey, and thank you for sharing this. I think this speaks to very eloquently to many of the points I was trying to make around understanding different cultures and contexts in which this conversation also sits and happens, and how we maybe start to shift the thinking into how do we change this whole system because it's not serving. It didn't, and it's brought us to this point. So I'm wondering and inviting others to reflect on this as well, if resilience feels an active enough concept, also to the point that's raised in the chat around what are the practices really to effect systems change, because it can also feel like we're just sort of holding on to this moment where we are, rather than really looking forward and breaking through the crises that we're seeing. And in that context, I want to also point to several of the questions in the chat around the polycrisis/meta crisis and whether resilience is a framework that can help us respond to it. So Susie, maybe I'll invite you in first to reflect on some of that based on your conversations, but then also others. We would love to hear other voices in this conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Stacey just said, right? That, and this maybe ties back actually to your short-term versus long-term question, right? What are we ultimately wanting here? If we want to just maintain, the late stage capitalism in all its, dysfunction, then yeah, just invest in the next disaster and the next disaster and the next one, right? Or do you want to change the narrative? Do you want to change human, nature relationship? Do you want to change human relationship? North, south, all of these different, ideas, right? And realities that have gotten us to this very point. This is where the entry of transformation into the concept of resilience actually, I think, is really important. It is trying ultimately to profoundly change really messed up systems, really dysfunctional systems that produce all the symptoms that we're now dealing with, including the symptom called Trump, right? Or dictatorship all over the world, wherever that is happening, and warfare and the rest of it. So to me, that is where long-term investment goals and orientation, the values that guide your choices as to what you invest in, come totally through. So to me, this is a wonderful input to really help us orient philanthropy toward transformative goals, not just to keep going in the sense of maintaining what we have, but keeping going as things fall apart, or as maybe Joanna Macy would say, right? We try to keep going in the great unraveling, amidst the great unraveling, while we actually try to effect the great turning, right? The great turning to a life-sustaining society. So that to me is, ultimately where the most long-term investment should be oriented.
Yes, I agree with that. And I'm seeing your point, Tamsin, in the chat. Philanthropy, I think this is not radical to say anymore, is an outgrowth of these systems, and at its worst upholds them. And as Stacey also just, I think, very eloquently highlighted, does not serve communities. And there are many, many, many people and actors in philanthropy who are working very hard every day to transform and to change. And so I think that this moment of crisis, to the point of, what do we do in this moment of polycrisis, is exactly that moment where we take that shock and we take the power and agency to reimagine. And to be fair, and I would love to hear if there are folks here from the community philanthropy space who would like to share a little bit. I feel like the community philanthropy space in many ways has been waiting for this and is ready for this quote unquote post-aid world, because there is this opportunity of reimagination in the crisis. So how do we work to strengthen local generosity and cultures of giving, not to, as you say, replace, but to transform, to reimagine? Certainly at Wings, we have a philanthropy transformation initiative that has been talking and looking at this and highlighting many, many great examples of this work for a couple of years now. And we sense that momentum, that in this crisis, as devastating as it is, we have this opportunity now to make it stick, to make the transformation stick. And I know many people think that's too optimistic, but we're the agents of this. We're the people who are doing this work. And I see this also in some of the comments. we need to take strength from this moment rather than feel devastated by it. And that's our own resilience. So I would love to see if there's anyone here from the community philanthropy space who would like to share a little bit about the conversations that you are having, and maybe how familiar this moment might feel to you. Let me see who's here who would like to share. No? So then let me get to one of the questions that I found quite interesting that speaks also to this conversation we're having now, which is around resilience as a framework being non-partisan and unifying. So does this work across the silos, across the spectrum? Susi, from your conversations that you have been having across the sector, is this the framing that we will use to get through this moment?
You know, it strikes me as in some ways we were given the framing. We were given the framing for this report because Packard decided it wanted to essentially frame everything it does through the resilience lens. And because we had done a report previously on that topic, you know, they felt like we were the right people to do it. I think that the probably the more unifying one is, and and I'm not saying that's not unproblematic in its own right, but a transformative one, right? Really moving to the kind of society and the kind of planet we think we want to have, and who's the we and who thinks that, right? And how do we foster those conversations? It's not a unified language at all, but to, you know, as a starting point to reinvest in a kind of polity where such conversations can still be had feels like a really important starting point. Like Stacey and others have been saying, it's not working now for so many. In fact, for the vast majority of people. I think we can have conversations and they should be supported at any level, at any geography, in any sector and across sectors to really do the deep, you know, what in some sector or some places is called scaling deep, to really think deeply about what is working, what do we want. One of the things that, you know, I keep finding is that the stop and go funding, oh, let's do something new in 3 years and then another thing new, whatever, that's not helpful because transformation doesn't work that fast. So just to have these conversations, you know, in like little flashes here and there, that's simply not enough. I think a signal that would tell me that you're in for with us in the transformation, you meaning philanthropy, would be that you have staying power, that you stay with something. And yes, not everything works. And then let's learn from that, but stay in the conversation about what is our pathway to a life-sustaining society, to reconnect humans in a way. And, you know, this is like the work that comes, this is why I said yesterday in my talk, I focused on myth. Like there are mythologies from centuries old, 1,000 years old, that tell us of this moment as the, you know, where we, you know, I'm thinking of the seventh fire prophecy, right, of the Anishinaabe, basically to choose in this moment whether or not we will light the fire, the eighth fire, or whether we're going to basically go up in flame and that's the end of human society. That's the choice, right? Whether it's the Shambhala warrior prophecy or any other cultural narrative about these profound choices. And so I feel like that's the conversation that I think people would actually be really excited to be part of, and to give them the space and support that conversation as an ongoing societal reckoning. To me, that would be a real sign of hope.
I love this point that it's a fundamentally human experience and our human story of survival, but also societal change and transformation and progress. And of course, sitting in it and experiencing it, you know, it feels very personal, monumental, difficult to navigate, but that historical look and understanding our human story can give us some of those tools and narratives to navigate it. And to me, that also speaks to the need for individual transformation and resilience, right? We talked about systems change, we talk about collective resilience, and that's all really important. But we also know that this is the individual work that we have to do, the inner work that also happens in the collective. And certainly from our perspective at Wings, that's where we're paying attention now. When we talk about philanthropy transformation, we're talking about the people in the system. And that's where we'll be having more and more, I think, conversation and spaces for this exchange and experience.
Yeah.
I want to invite Jerry. Yeah, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, it's such a great point, and they're not obviously mutually exclusive, right? To do system change versus personal change, but to me, this is what so many are now trying, right? To create spaces in which we actually build our capacities again to go through this very, very difficult internal transformation. In my own work, and again, just in the climate context, this is what Tamsin mentioned earlier. I do something, or I'm directing something called the Adaptive Mind Project, and it is a skill building initiative, a capacity building initiative for peoples who work in the climate space. And that's just simply because that's what I know best. It's not, restricted in any way to them, but it is oriented toward, in some sense, first restoring enough so we can even learn and sit down and do that deep work, right? To engage in very deep healing at the level of, whether it's dealing with the traumas that we're experiencing all in the climate space right now, or the centuries of layered traumas, collective trauma that we all personally and collectively have gone through, but then also really learn navigational skills, if you will, to go through this arc of transformation that we're all in, right? And so I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. It's just one of many initiatives now out there that do this sort of work. And I think it's absolutely essential that we work on both the deep inner as well as the outer. And I think it would be a really false dichotomy to say, oh, we don't have time for the inner in the midst of that.
Right.
We're simply not going to get through the outer change and do it deeply enough if we don't do also the inner work. Anyway, enough.
And there's the sort of parallel between the short term and long term and the inner and the outer, right? I think that's coming through. I also, just before I invite you in, Jerry, I just want to name that there are many communities that have been in this moment, that have felt this oppression, that have been resilient and resistant for a long time. And I think what we really need to do is learn and listen from these strategies and tactics and be a partner to them, rather than sort of now it feels personal. There was a comment in the chat around, when will philanthropy wake up? What is the moment? When it starts to feel personal, then of course it starts to become more real. But there are many who have already been here, who are now very importantly needed to help us lead this through this transition. Jerry, I'd like to invite you in.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm going to sort of present this more like a question, although I'm slightly concerned at the moment about the way we're talking about these things, because it seems in a way that we're talking about something that's happening to us and not validating, in fact, that something that people have been doing for centuries is dealing with crisis, coping with it, responding to it, showing resilience, and being resilient. And it's not something we give to anybody else. It's something that people actually have demonstrated from time immemorial. And maybe that's where some of these stories come in. And one of the problems, I think, is that we keep defaulting to the notion that somehow philanthropy is a perfect tool, or there can be a perfect tool like philanthropy. And it just simply isn't. The motivations for people in philanthropy, what's driving, what the purposes are for different people, what people are getting out of it in each instance are so different, are so complicated that it's really not a well that's going to respond to the kind of crisis we're talking about. And it seems to me that your point, Susie, about inner and outer, or quick and slow, actually is about two things. It's first, we need to react to what's going on now, clearly, and part of that may in fact be befuddlement at things as they come at us fast and furious. And secondly, it's to prepare so that we're actually better at responding to crises than we have been. And the first thing you have to then admit is that you've been outplayed. In Ethiopia, which is where I come from, there's a game of chess called centrage. And the game of chess is exactly the same as the European American form of chess. The only difference is the beginning. The beginning has a period where both players put pieces on the board instantly. They don't wait for each other. They build the best strategy they possibly can as quickly as they can before the game starts. And they move the pieces, and then the other person sees how the other person has moved the pieces and moves their pieces accordingly. So that essentially by the time you start actually having the battle, you have built your own impregnable fortress or whatever it is that you have to do. And you then move with calm, but in a very long game. And the Trump administration in the last month has been doing centrage. They've been moving fast and furious along all the different fronts. And I would expect us to react to that by replacing, by reacting, by putting things in place. But I also think there's a deep thinking that has to come to actually invent new proposals, new things to offer. And as a world with less aid, with more armaments, and with governments that are sorely trying to put resources on the table becomes apparent, surely we have to start thinking about where are new resources going to come from. And part of that might be indeed, I've been arguing for a long time, we need to start looking at, remittance money. We need to start looking at illicit flows. We need to start looking at fines to organizations that have been involved in illicit flows or in drug money and so on. And we have to start identifying resources and making the case to policymakers that there are resources. But the expectation that philanthropy can somehow meet the void, I think, is illusional. So I'll stop there. I'm ranting, so I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you for all these comments, and I agree with many of them. One of the things that I want to maybe state clearly is that our report never argued nor ever assumes that philanthropy can fill the void. If that came across in any way, then, I'll definitely revise the report. It was never meant to be, and I don't think we said anything like it. It has just all of a sudden, in the absence of a federal administration that could provide money and has, substantially put money forward for climate mitigation and adaptation in the last 4 years, all of a sudden, philanthropy is like the one game that we know, right? It doesn't mean it can ever fill that gap. Absolutely not. It is just, okay, with the resources that you do have, what is the most useful thing you can do with them in the absence of having just decapitated, essentially, the funding structure, the governance structure in this country. So that's number one. I'm really curious about your ideas of getting money out of illicit trade and whatnot that I hadn't thought about. That's a really interesting one. I think there's plenty of money to go around. I mean, we have, gazillion dollars to put into military. We have gazillion money to put into subsidies for well-established industries like the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it is truly a matter of what do we value and what do we buy into of what we feel like we have to put money toward. So that could change. But to how to do that, that's the bigger question, right? Exactly, like how difficult is it to get philanthropy to up to 5% of spending down? Those are the break the bank kind of questions. So I would say, we have a tremendous funding void at the moment that we're trying to fill. And the question remains, what is most useful? I guess my answer to that in the near term is very much playing that long game that you spoke to. And the principles we put forward in that report, I think actually could go quite a long way toward building, not just being able to respond to, what's necessary, but to change the systems towards something better. So, if nothing else, to maybe just go through, every portfolio to see, are we investing in really? And I just want to quickly pick up on Michael Lerner's comment. Has there ever been a quantitative or any other kind of serious evaluation? Not that I'm aware of. There's lots of tracking, where did the money go? But in terms of a true evaluation, was it well spent? Did we achieve what we wanted? That does not exist. And it is actually exceedingly difficult, which is why we have, I think, our two assessments as the best thing instead. And I'm not saying it's a great thing. What I'm saying is, given the widespread dispersed nature of adaptation, no philanthropy has ever been willing to fund a very careful assessment. We have the National Climate Assessment, in which we have every 4 years an update on adaptation and what we know about it. But these are all sort of taking these pulse checks all over the country. And, that's the best we can do with the resources we've been given. Would be great to do something more thorough, but hasn't been done.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that, and thank you, Michael, for that question. Maybe Jerry, also to say paying taxes. That would also be a good start, I think. But in all honesty, I think philanthropy, I completely agree, and I hope that's coming across. Philanthropy isn't going to plug this gap, not as it is. And we really need to start thinking about philanthropy differently. What it means, and I want to also lift up against Stacey's comment on indigenous philanthropy. What are we actually talking about? We're talking about generosity, we're talking about systems change that can show up in lots of different ways. I think where we all collectively have a role to play, is to amplify the voices that we're hearing, to be a collective voice and an advocate in different spaces, because we have a very large combined power, and we often sort of shy away from that collectively. And again, I see a lot of importance here for the networks that are able to bring that diverse and collective voice into those spaces, and so that it's not even one or two actors who are sort of showing up and then themselves targets are on the radar. And philanthropy is also a partner, and I hope that's been coming through the conversation here. And I'd be remiss not to mention a couple of pieces of work. Our member Latin Pacto in Latin America is releasing a report on Thursday about multi-stakeholder partnerships for climate and biodiversity in Latin America, where they've analyzed these kinds of partnerships where philanthropy joins up with private sector and public sector. What's working, what do we need in terms of an enabling environment and ecosystem for more of these? So if you're interested in that, we can share the link to the webinar where they launch it. And then with our Philanthropy for Climate initiative, which now has over 800 foundations signed up globally, it really is not so much about funding these strategies. That is important, but really crucially, it's about investments, right? And those of us who've been around long enough in the climate space remember the Divest Invest movement. That's very much for me. So much like, rich people paying taxes, it is that question of investment. So I'm glad that came up. Yeah, and on the question of climate philanthropy, I would just throw in the mix. We have seen more momentum in climate philanthropy in response to this current moment than maybe in other spaces. I mean, there was a Bloomberg announcement, which was probably the most public one, but there have been further announcements and different types of resources made available. And I think that's because the climate philanthropy space, by and large, was already in this crisis, understands this crisis, has been thinking about these concepts. More than maybe other parts of the sector have. And what are we talking about when we talk about measuring the impact of climate philanthropy? I would also just want to name that, because one of the struggles that I have with climate philanthropy is the sort of insistence on measuring carbon emissions, and that's then our impact if we've reduced X amount. What we're talking about is people, is lives, it's community resilience. So I think the question of how to measure that and measure what actually matters is a key one here. Maybe it would take us too far, of course, but Susi, I wanted to see if you've got any reflections on that question of learning and measuring, to pick up from your earlier point, before we
I mean,
last minute reflections.
Yeah, so one of the statements one of the findings really that we have in this report is that monitoring, evaluation, learning are essentially rare and very spotty practices right now in the climate resilience building efforts across the US, at least. I think it's become more of a standard practice in international aid and development projects than it is in US philanthropy. And if so, it is pretty perfunctory, I would say, what I've seen. I've spent the last 10, 15 years really on the question of what the successful adaptation look like. How would we know we're moving in that direction? There are definitely frameworks and ways of thinking about that. There are tools for that out there, but it is not generally thought about and required, as a portion of philanthropic, or for that matter, public funding. Just as an example, with some of the funding that came through the infrastructure law and the bipartisan law that we just had here to fund a lot of the resilience efforts and mitigation efforts, there was never a requirement attached that people actually report back on what is working, how did it come out. It's such a missed opportunity, right? Given the magnitude of the experimentation, we could have actually gotten to some really good data. And if you will, for, if there ever is another democratic or more favorable institution that might think resilience investment is a good idea, for them to then learn from the programs how they were designed and how they were implemented. So unfortunately, we don't have that. And I think it is, if you want to speed up, if you will, the resilience building's effort at all, then learning is the most useful thing to do, right? Because otherwise we're just repeating the same things over and over, learning separately, not from each other, and it's simply a waste of time. So if you want to think about accelerating, then learning and communicating, both would be two really critical investments. Communicating, I was speaking with one person for this most recent Packard report who does a lot of work in communication, and he compared it to Hollywood. When Hollywood produces a movie, say for $100 million, they invest another $100 million for the communication of the movie. That's unheard of. For us, it's like maybe a 2% part of whatever grant we might get, right, from philanthropy or from the government for that matter, and they're just investing 100% in addition into the communication of it. That's a model, if you will, that makes sure that you know about it, right? We don't know. This is, and goes back to Michael's comment earlier. We don't know all the things that are going on and what's working, what's not working. Such a shame. So I would just say, if I were to wave my magic wand on things that would actually accelerate and help us out tremendously, it would be in the MEL space and in the communication space.
Amazing. Let me then ask you my final question to you, which drills that down a little bit more. And what would you like to see happen with this report, very concretely now, given this framing that you've just given?
Yeah.
What would be your hope?
So, well, ideally, I would, love to have many, many conversations like this with other funders, simply for them to have awareness of it. And we have developed sort of a spec sheet for how to evaluate grants based on the report. So there are so many ways in which this can become a really practical tool. If you see other opportunities to take this to colleagues of yours, to bring this in gatherings of philanthropists to have this conversation, I'd be more than happy to speak to it, or my colleague Joyce Coffey to come speak to it, and essentially draw on this expertise and experience, and inform your internal strategic conversations. So I just hope it goes into many, many more hands, and is actually not just a report on the shelf, but becomes sort of a tool for helping to inform the really critical decisions that you're all now making. And thank you for making them.
Yeah, I would echo that and say, use this report, use all the various annexes with the practical tools, because for me, if I were to summarize this conversation, which was very wide-ranging, and I just want to thank everyone for all the contributions. We have the tools, we have the language, we have the framing, we have the people, and we have the organizations, right? We have everything in place. So this is really the moment where we need to rely on and strengthen our collective and individual resilience in order to reimagine the system in which we operate. So I still have the faith in us, in all of that, the tools, the framing, the people especially that are here, that have contributed. And that's also what continues to build my own resilience in this work. So I hope we stay in touch. I hope we continue to exchange. And I want to pass it back to you, Tamsin, as our convener to close us off. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eva and Susie, and thanks everyone for your comments and questions. I will share the recording and the notes, and Susie has put her email in the chat, which I will include in the notes. But Eva, very grateful for your walking us through this conversation, and Susie, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all. Great to be here.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Tamsin.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, everyone. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Very good comments, Michael.
Thank
You should have said something.
I think
I prefer to be quiet.
I think Michael set the stage for a conversation with Angela, though.
Susie, that was lovely. Thank you so much.